Well, good morning, everybody. This is a very challenging time with this virtual summit because I see one of our speakers still is not there, but we've all been challenged. So welcome, and I'll just start the ball rolling, and I'm assuming that we'll be able to get somebody in there. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to our last session of the day, entitled Paving the Way for a Safer Future. We've already heard this morning from esteemed speakers and panellists about the crisis itself, putting health technology to work, and specifically about the accelerated global vaccine development. In this session, we'll focus on health technologies or frameworks of health technologies required to future-proof our communities or countries from the later stages of this pandemic and future pandemics or other health emergencies. In Australia, our response to the COVID pandemic was tremendously assisted or only made possible by our sophisticated public and private healthcare system that's integrally linked to our medical research institutes and universities. This was a comment made specifically by our health minister in the earlier discussions. These institutes are populated with highly skilled medical scientific research staff with capabilities in life sciences research, such as molecular genetics, genomic sequencing, bioengineering, immunotherapy and virology, drug and vaccine development, as we've heard just now. They have been in place in Australia for many decades and cover all the areas of research relevant to fighting this COVID pandemic. These institutes, we'll hear more about them from two of our speakers actually. The early release of the genetic sequence of the virus from China allowed our institutes to work on novel vaccines, and it was these research capabilities in Australia that enabled the novel coronavirus to be grown in cell culture for the first time outside of China, and that was shared with the WHO, working with expert laboratories around the world to develop tests to detect the presence of the virus. So we have on our panel Professor Ian Fraser, who is a clinician scientist based at the University of Queensland, invented the technology that has enabled a vaccine against human papillomavirus that prevents cervical cancer in women. This is currently used worldwide and has led to a dramatic drop in incidences and deaths from these preventable cancers. It's also no coincidence that one of Australia's vaccine candidates, the so-called molecular clamp vaccine that we've heard about, is being developed at the University of Queensland, and it's now working towards regulatory approval and phase 3 clinical trials. We're particularly pleased to have newly appointed Chief Scientist of Australia, Dr. Cathy Foley, also Chief Scientist of CSIRO, welcome Cathy, and serial entrepreneur, Dr. Errol Harvey, who is CEO of one of Australia's foremost research institutes, the Aikenhead Centre for Medical Discovery. We're also delighted to have Simos Anastasopoulos, who is president of the GFCC in Greece. We're looking forward to hearing about the Greece space. And we asked you to have our friend from Japan, Hamaguchi-san, who I can't see on our screen. So I presume we're having technical difficulties there, not having him present. But if I could perhaps start the ball rolling, and one of the interesting things that we've noted has been particularly the different country responses that have occurred around the world in fighting the first onset of the virus and how successful or not that response has been. We've heard a lot about it as Australia's experience, but perhaps I could ask Simos to give us first-hand experience of what Greece did in the initial responses to the pandemic, and perhaps what you might be looking at, how you change that response, and later on we might get into what different countries around Europe did. Simos, could I hand to you?
Thank you, Jane, and good morning to you all. Well, good evening to the United States, and I will not say good night, but I will express my appreciation to our European friends that are awake and watching. It is great to participate in a panel with such level of Australian and Japanese expertise, and present a wider and less scientific view, I'm sure, about the COVID and vaccine development in Greece and in Europe. At the beginning of this year, as you might all know, Greece was emerging from 10 years of economic crisis and depression with high hopes and planning, I might add, for significant growth. The prospects for the economy were looking good, but the economy remained fragile as all of the ratings of competitiveness suggested at the time. And then, of course, the pandemic erupted and all planning and all prospects reverted to survival mode. As our health system is for several years underfinanced and our ability to translate research into products or patents remains extremely low, it is really surprising how well the country responded to the COVID crisis. The early measures taken by the government and the people's response has limited the pandemic's effect during the first wave in spring, and at the same time, it has allowed for an effective response to the challenges presented. The Eurozone support, of course, and the government's response, mainly financial and red tape cutting, allowed for a rapid technology transfer to manufacture locally essential items to prevent COVID spreading. It also mobilized our scientific community, our doctors, which are already renowned for their research papers production, to participate in international scientific research that assisted to comprehend the disease and examine pharmaceutical and respiratory support schemes to increase the survival rate at the intensive care units. Europe's response, of course, was impressive and unprecedented. To help repair the economic and social damage, the EU leaders have agreed on a recovery plan that will lead the way out of the crisis and lay the foundations for a modern and more sustainable future. The early support and financing of 2 novel vaccines projects has been instrumental in the development of an effective vaccine. I'm sure you know BioNTech's success. It will probably be the first to get a license, and CureVac is already in phase 2 trials with promising results. And let me stay at this for the moment, and I give it back to you, Jane, and follow with answers to the questions.
Thank you, Simos, and thank you for that. We're still missing our Japanese friend, so I guess that's still technical issues. So I might pivot to you, Kathy, to talk about the CSIRO and its role as a multidisciplinary research massive body, and how it has brought its different technologies together to look at solving these problems, and specifically with relation to the pandemic.
So thanks very much. I guess the way CSIRO responded was multifaceted, because we're a multidisciplinary research organisation, and our role is to really bridge that gap between what's happening in the basic and fundamental research area to see how we can translate things for impact. So things we were involved with were in data analytics, being able to gather the data that have been provided by a range of different places, and be able to do forecasting, identify trends, and proactively work out or recommend ways for government to have the data there so that they can make decisions on ways to control the virus in the absence of a vaccine. So we were able to identify ways to respond to outbreaks in different places, and be also able to have a dashboard that was readily available and updated and be used by many of policymakers for their modelling decision making. The next thing was then looking at supporting the vaccines. So we had been prepared for a pandemic back 4 years ago, when we made decisions on what we needed to do with our Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, which is able to do research on animal testing of drugs. So we were able, under CEPI, to test 2 vaccines, and one from Oxford Instruments and one from the USA, and be able to fast track them through a ferret model which we had developed. Another thing we did was work with University of Queensland to help them to scale up their drug, which you talked about earlier on, so that they were able to have take the developed drug from the laboratory into the scale up volumes under the right conditions, so that they could be used for both animal trials and human trials. And then the other is looking at different diagnostic techniques, working with the University of Queensland to be able to detect the virus in wastewater, and that's been very successful in what's seemingly predictive identification of hotspots because they're able to detect the virus before it often has symptoms in people experiencing the virus. Then the other was looking at the virus itself, doing studies on its impact on how long it lives on surfaces, just actually understanding the virus itself in terms of being able to look at the different strains and understand that, and then looking at the PPE response. So how we can work with the federal government and with state governments to be able to garner the different manufacturers to pivot, I guess, their manufacturing to things like masks, ventilators, finding supply chains, and then testing of masks, because all testing of masks were not done in Australia, they were done overseas. So we rapidly pulled together the ability to test the masks. That's just a snapshot of some of the things we were doing. We were able to bring about 200 people together across the organisation to work on different aspects of things relating to COVID.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. And I think it really highlights the way the Australian public institutions such as the CSIRO were able to support the government's response and also the private partnerships that you mentioned as well. So pivoting to that, Errol, perhaps you could talk about, since you've been in a public institution, but I've seen a lot of this translation in this partnership with the private as well. How do we use these public institutions and the fantastic research and the results of this research? How does that actually get out to the community? And as someone who's done this many times, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how that worked, and maybe if it related to any of the things that you're doing with the pandemic response as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I think one of the things that we've learned from this pandemic, and it's come out very clearly from previous speakers, is that countries and parts of the economy that have done well are those that have managed to coordinate a lot of different bits and get them to work together to a clear goal. And it's been interesting to see that the wealth of a nation is not directly related to the effectiveness that nations have been able to do that. And we can think of very wealthy nations that have perhaps struggled more than others in that coordination role. And if you think about coordinating a lot of different specialist skills and bringing them together, I'm going to give a shout out to my profession. It's what engineers do all the time. If you think of complex engineering projects, they are always about coordinating a whole bunch of different skills and trying to get them to meet a specific target. And so the center that I lead, the ACMD, we believe engineering is going to be the future of medicine. And if you think of what an entrepreneur does, it's the same thing. An entrepreneur is trying to coordinate a whole bunch of things, from finance to resources to supply chain and so on, to meet a market need. So I think that one of the lessons that we have from this is the connection from good science and excellent science in the health area the translation process of that science to something that impacts people's lives is always good engineering. And if you think about the problems of scaling up diagnostics, of the problems of scaling up vaccine production, I mean, my centre's in the middle of St. Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. And when the pandemic hit us first in March, the busiest people were civil engineers as we saw them trying to rebuild new ICUs and plumb in oxygen facilities in places that hadn't been there before. So I think, yeah, the opportunity for that science translation using good engineering project management principles is something that we'll definitely use going forward from here.
Thank you, Errol. We seem to have lost Professor Fraser, who I was going to engage with next, but I'll maybe come back to you, Simos, and given the discussion that we've been having, perhaps you can help us understand in your situation in Greece how you access this pharmaceutical or the new vaccine developments, and how that plays out in your country when you have access to, you know, lots of neighbours as well who, if you could give us an idea of how that plays out in Greece, the translation of this new research into the new drug treatments and the vaccine treatments.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you again. You might, one thing that we need to understand is Greece is a country where not much research, especially in the health sector, is done. But fortunately, Greece is part of the European Union, and therefore we do benefit from all of the efforts of the European Union towards a vaccine development, or all the measures that we're taking. From one side, it was the response of the government and the people was very effective in dealing with the pandemic at the first stage. Now, of course, we are going through a second wave, which is more severe. Still, though, Greece is one of the countries that performs very well even in this second wave. The European Union has announced, contracts with all of the major manufacturers of vaccines, and Greece will certainly benefit from that. We do expect that whatever the first vaccine that arrives in the market will be, Greece will be part of this European scheme, and we do expect to have about 5 million of vials. Greece, the whole population of the country is 10 million. So we do expect that the medical people, the health professionals, the armed forces, and of course the more sensitive people with underlying diseases will be the first to be vaccinated. We expect that this will happen until Easter time, the first month of summer, and the whole population might have a good chance to be vaccinated until the end of the year. The impressive part regarding Greek research, clinical research mostly, is the response of the medical community, which has individually in Greece been part of several research projects. We participated in the clinical trials for remdesivir, for example. Plus all the part of the plasma and anti-gen research that was done, the papers were done in Greek hospitals. And I believe that this was the major participation and offer from the Greek community to Europe and to the world.
Okay. Many thanks. I see now we have, we can welcome back Professor Ian Fraser, and a very warm welcome to Michinari Hamaguchi, who is President of the Japanese Science and Technology Agency. So I'm sorry we've had those technical difficulties, but welcome. I wonder if I could ask Hamaguchi-san, is it possible, can you hear me? Yes, to ask for, we would really enjoy to hear your experience in Japan, and what your frameworks and what you have done in Japan to fight the COVID pandemic, and perhaps lead us through, you've talked about a plan B if plan A doesn't work. I'm not sure whether, is that possible? Can you hear me? I'm not sure whether Hamaguchi-san, is it still having some technical difficulties there? Professor Fraser, can you raise your hand if you can hear me? I'm hoping you can hear me. Fabulous.
I can hear you.
Perhaps I can give it to you, Ian. You may have missed some of this broadcast, but you've had some incredible experiences as a developer and inventor of a novel vaccine. You know what the challenges are in translating that. You're a clinician scientist, particularly relevant in this environment, and your role as head of the advisory board on how monies are spent from the Medical Research Future Fund in Australia, and we're talking about how we invest in the future here. Perhaps you could share some of your experience in how you saw COVID pandemic evolving, how it was happening, and perhaps some of the, I guess, what the vaccine technologies are, probably the skill sets that we have in Australia that allowed us to do that. So, Professor Fraser.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me all right. I have to say the quality of the connection is not particularly good.
Yes.
I was involved very much in the development of the technology that led to the papillomavirus vaccine, which at that time was a novel technology in the sense that we were using recombinant DNA technology and expressing proteins in eukaryotic systems for effectively the first time, certainly the first time for a vaccine. And but we did have the luxury that there wasn't an urgency to get a product out there. We knew that papillomavirus vaccines could potentially be useful, but at that time we didn't even know the scale of what we were going to end up doing. And of course now we're aiming through the WHO policy to eradicate cervical cancer through vaccination and screening over the course of the next less than 10 years in Australia and globally this century. So that we had the luxury of plenty of time. It took 2 or 3 years of lab work to get to the technology working, and then Merck, who took on the project with CSL, took a further 10 years of clinical trials after having extended the methodology for making the vaccine from sort of teaspoons full to swimming pools full, so that they could make enough for global use. So that luxury of time allowed a lot of careful planning of safety studies, of relative efficacy studies, and of education programs to actually roll the vaccine out. Of course, with the new pandemic, we're facing all of these problems accelerated, and the big challenges are going to be deciding between the various different vaccines that are now becoming available based on the results from sort of really very early stage 3 clinical trials. I think that the biggest problem we're going to face now is that with 3 vaccines that look like they're going to be effective in phase 3 clinical trials, very shortly it will no longer be ethical to do placebo-controlled clinical trials of efficacy, because we'll have vaccines which are likely licensed for use, at least for emergency purposes in many countries. And we'll just have to take the vaccines the other ones that we have into what will be comparative efficacy studies, which will be much longer and much slower. So I think we're really in a quite a challenging position right at the moment with the global pandemic to work out how best to proceed to be efficient in delivering these vaccines.
Yes, Professor Fraser, in fact, one of the questions that's come through from the audience is asking that very question, which I know you've had experience in within the equitable distribution of the cervical cancer vaccine, for example, and they're asking, would the WHO have a role in ensuring that all countries and world population gets equal access to the vaccines? And is it dependent upon each country to contract vaccine developing organisations to secure vaccines for their population?
Yes, it's been interesting to observe how that's developed. I mean, initially what happened was that the vaccine manufacturers realized that a large part of the market was going to be in the developing world. And they quite early on introduced differential pricing for the vaccine so that the cost of development of vaccines was very much sheeted home to the developed countries, and then the vaccines that are distributed in the developing world are the same vaccines but sold at a cost which more reflects the cost of manufacture and distribution, and not the rather expensive $2 billion cost of the vaccine development. That has been helped also, of course, by charitable work from the Gates Foundation, for example, the World Bank and UNICEF, to ensure that vaccine programs can be delivered for the papillomavirus vaccine. And the WHO have adopted a philosophy that they believe that vaccine should be made available at cost in most of the developing world, but getting that implemented will require more vaccine manufacture. And it's worth pointing out that the vaccine manufacture for the papillomavirus vaccine, we haven't got the capacity to deliver that vaccine globally at the rate that will be needed in order to control cervical cancer at the moment, although there are more companies coming on stream now, particularly in Southeast Asia, India and China, to make vaccine. So we haven't ever delivered a vaccine globally across the entire population of any sort. We target young children with vaccines like measles, but that's a rather relatively captive market. To think about a vaccine which we're going to give to the entire world population to control the pandemic is a very much different scale of things. And yes, it is going to be a case of each country, I suspect, doing its own thing initially, because the governments will be paying for a vaccine initially, and as our Australian government intends to do, and they'll be wanting to ensure, first of all, that the Australian population is protected, and then start thinking about how they can contribute on a global basis.
And Professor Fraser, while I've got you, I'm scared you're going to disappear again. But one of the questions, I think, where the title of this is Paving the Way for a Safer Future, and in this rush to get the vaccine development accelerated, what are the major concerns that we have about ethically accelerating that vaccine to market, and what are the things that we potentially should be watching out for to make sure that we're not charging ahead when it's not appropriate, or the cure is worse than the pandemic, so to speak?
Well, we obviously have to make sure that the vaccines that are coming on stream are safe, and safe in the longer term, and safe against rare complications. What that really means is, because this is such an important thing to get the vaccines out there, that we're going to do this after the event, and we're going to have to be very conscientious about data gathering in those countries that are equipped to do the data gathering, and look at the length of protection, for example, and the possibility of rare but important side effects from 1 in 100,000 patients vaccinated. The responsibility for that will lie with the countries that can afford to do it, because I really can't imagine that many countries in the developing world will be well enough organized beyond the need to actually keep records of who has been vaccinated in some way, so that at least those vaccines that require 2 doses, we can check that people have got the 2 doses of vaccine. So there's a major ethical responsibility on the countries that can afford to do the longer term follow-up work to do that, to ensure that whichever vaccine that country decides to employ is monitored closely for safety and efficacy over a period of time.
Thank you. And if we're looking at frameworks for the future, perhaps I could come back to you, Kathy, I know that we have the RIIF, which is the Rapid Research Information Forum, and perhaps, talking about capability of countries in protecting themselves from future health crises, what role that might have in dissemination of information. Looking at frameworks for the future, perhaps I could come back to you, Kathy, We're getting a bit of feedback.
I think I got that. The sounds a bit wobbly.
Yes.
But I guess that rapid response to science questions that are coming from government has proven to be very helpful during the pandemic, where a minister's been able to raise a question, and then through our academies of science, and also through Science and Technology Australia, which is a body representing our researchers across the whole of Australia, we're able to then identify, first of all, people who would lead the data gathering, and also then peer review, a separate group peer review that work, so that then they could have publicly available information which was able to provide at at fast pace the relevant information. For example, one which just comes to mind is this was more from a social impact, but what is the social impact of the coronavirus on women in the research, particularly women in research, having been working so hard to try and lift the number of women in science and technology, maths and engineering. The pandemic wasn't making a hit on that, which would mean it'd take many years to recover. So there were many other questions, much more technical as well. And this proved to be very useful because the people doing it worked over a very short space of time. I think they had 10 days in order to gather this information. And then also making sure that it was quality peer reviewed meant that it gave a level of assurance to government that they had the best information at hand at that time over a whole swag of things, including the social science, the medical sciences, and also some of the physical work, such as aspects to manufacturing materials and ventilators and things like that.
Thank you. I see on my screen now that we have our Michinari Hamaguchi. Can you hear me? President of the Japan Science and Technology Agency. So welcome. And we are nearly at the end of our session, but I would really love to hear, as would our listeners, I'm sure, to hear about the Japanese experience in fighting the pandemic and what your plan A has been and potentially what your plan B is.
Yeah.
President of the Japan Science and Technology Agency.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't join. We had some trouble, but let me briefly summarize our situation. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic has remained relatively small in Japan. For example, as of November 17th, the number of total deaths in Japan is 1,800, while those in the US is 25,252,000. So it's very small. This is 10 times smaller than world average of mortality in Japan. I think we studied a lot from the first wave, and I think the universal healthcare insurance care system has significantly contributed in our case. It allows everyone to access equal medical resource regardless of income difference. In addition, concise and clear message from the government appears to work well. For example, avoid 80% of contact opportunities and avoid the 3 C's. 3 C's means closed spaces, crowded place, and close contact setting. This idea helps people to make behavior change. The high adoption rate of CT, computed tomography, that reveal asymptomatic patient quickly rather than PCR testing. This is also our advantage in Japan, I think. I would also like to mention a distinctive Japanese strategy. Even in the emergence during the first wave of infections, the government requested but not enforced a restriction on outing. We didn't have lockout, cluster intervention, and indeed effective at the time. Offering proper scientific information to the people is indeed important to prevent spreading infection. Even in response to a crisis like COVID-19, we must respect individual decision, but we should offer proper information. We at JST are promoting a strategy we call Plan B. It is a multidisciplinary approach to create a society in which we can move, meet, gather, and do business freely under COVID-19 conditions. I know clinical trials of vaccine and drug is important. We call this Plan A, but it takes time. So during that time, until we can get a good vaccine, we need to study as a field to minimize infection. For example, IT engineering, we have many things like this. This is a hand gel. Hand gel. We can clean now. Also, we have a special mask. It made by ostrich egg. It contains antibody against COVID-19, so we can cover the mouse with antibody to prevent infection. We have another type mask. This contains silver to block accumulate small particles. Also, we have these washing gels everywhere. This kind of improvement of our lifestyle minimize infection. This is our idea to support people. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry to delay.
No, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm very pleased that you were able to join us. We're just going a little over time. So one of the audience questions that I thought was relevant to all of our panelists here, which is interesting, is what about creating a global scientific SWAT team that specialises in rapid response to calamities like this pandemic? So perhaps different versions of WHO. It says here that engineers work fast. We need, to be a global and so I'm getting terrible feedback. Perhaps Kathy,
Jane, I might be able to help there. I'm not sure if you can hear me through that. We might need to mute everybody that's speaking. Oh, that's better. So whether we should, I think there has sort of been an informal SWAT team where the chief scientists across many different countries were meeting regularly and sharing their information and their approaches. Whether that was followed by government policy was a secondary issue. But I think that this is something where it was great to see the chief scientists of the different countries coming together, and I think this might be something which could be formalised. It's something I know in my new role as Australia's chief scientist, I'll be looking to see if there's an interest in that, because it's a good pathway to share information and put it in forms which is digestible as well, and also trusted, which I think is always sometimes some of the challenges as well. I can't hear you now.
Jane, we've just lost your sound there for a moment.
Sorry, because of the feedback, I muted myself. So it gave a big shout out to engineers, saying engineers work fast and scientists work faster. So with being the engineer here, perhaps you could...
Yeah, look, I think rather than pointing at one side or the other for slowing things down, a couple of the questions in the chat have touched on a really important issue, which is around the risk. Who shares what risk in this whole process? And, Professor Fraser had a good discussion about safety, but safety isn't the only risk in these. There are economic risks. If you're scaling up manufacturing, it's a financial risk. If you're getting yourself prepared for a pandemic that may or may not take place, whose role is it to take that risk and to fund that? I think one of the things that's been very interesting in these recent times is the risk of doing nothing has suddenly become much more important than the risk of not doing the best thing. And so one of the things that has always slowed stuff down is huge discussions about, yes, this is good, but is it the best? Suddenly, we now have a different perspective on that risk. And I think when we look at the entrepreneurial risks, the financial risks of who is it that should take the risk of investing in the time, the effort, the manufacturing equipment to do this, we need a better discussion amongst public sector bodies and also amongst the private sector as to where is the best place to have that risk and who should be paying for any solutions to mitigate that.
Thank you. We've already gone a little over now, so I am, we've lost another panelist. We've probably got a few minutes for closing remarks until we
if I may, Jane.
Yes, please, Simos.
It is a very interesting question, the last, because I think in dealing with the pandemic, we had the first expression of global cooperation into that. And the base for all of this was open source technologies. The genetic sequence of the virus was decoded very early. It was published on the internet on at least 2 platforms, and all of the scientists all around the world and the engineers benefited from that. So I do think that applying new technologies was extremely helpful for everybody. And this is one of the reasons that we have so early, so good results in so many vaccine developments or in dealing with the pandemic.
Thank you. Hamaguchi-san, would you be able to make a comment on that in relation to having a global SWAT team and having all countries working together, where everybody is contributing to a body of knowledge, information is shared? Make a comment on that in relation to having a global SWAT team and having all countries working together, where everybody contributes to a body of knowledge, information is shared.
I think the most important thing is transparency and share the knowledge and leave the decision to the citizen rather than government. But we have to offer proper information every day to help them make a decision. This is most important thing in our case. Then everybody change their attitude. That's a baseline for this in our situation right now we are facing without vaccine or without effective drug. And let's change our attitude together. That's my message to all the people. Thank you for attention anyway.
Thank you, Hamaguchi-san. Thank you. I'm glad you were able to join us at that. So we have, I'm told, a couple of more minutes for anyone who wants to make any closing remarks. We've had a little bit of a disjointed situation with our technical difficulties, been quite tricky. One of the panel questions that was asked in the beginning was, what's the role of telemedicine in the COVID-19 context? And it was interesting listening to the Minister talk about 40 million cases of telehealth in Australia, something that was planned over a decade and it happened over a few months.
Yes, Jane, it's Gabby here. I think that's probably something which is a takeaway from this global pandemic, and that is not to underestimate what as humans we can achieve when we really work together, and when we also have a specific goal, and also what you can mess up if you don't really go through and work in a collaborative way. I think the telemedicine is a really nice example of how often we tend, because we're always managing that trust, risk, economic balancing, and also the social license to be able to do things. Sometimes a pandemic has given, and a crisis situation gives us a chance to actually push the boundaries in ways which we don't normally do, and surprise ourselves as a population of what we're willing to accept. I think it's going to be interesting to see. Eventually, we'll be, I'm hopeful we'll be seeing our way through this pandemic into some level of normality. And I think what will be interesting will be to see how much we will be doing, living differently, what the new normal will be like, our new ways of working, for example, the idea of what does it mean to be a worker, whether you can work from home effectively, travel, all those things, through to also adoption of new technologies, digital medicine or telemedicine being a classic one. Also, I think it will be really interesting to see what the new world order will be as we will, we have seen things from whether it's vaccine availability through to sovereignty of supply for important personal protection, through to looking at how quickly you can change directions when you need to, if there's clear leadership, clear direction, and a pathway forward.
I think that one of the things that we have learned from the global pandemic so far is that we have to know more about how the environment changes human behavior. I mean, one of the things that has become very obvious during the course of the pandemic is that while we might encourage people to do things, and if they feel there's enough immediate pressure to do it, they will do it in their own interests. When it comes now to trying to control the spread of the virus globally, the vast majority of people do not wish to hear the advice that we give them because they don't feel it's relevant for them. And they have facilitated the rapid spread of the virus, particularly in communities where education programs haven't been as directed as they have been in Australia. So the social sciences are going to be as important as the biological sciences in looking after the future and protecting ourselves against the next pandemic, which inevitably will come at some point.
And Jane, my closing comment would be around something that's already been mentioned, the importance of huge data sets, the fact that we are measuring so rigorously and sharing that information. We mentioned about things like machine learning systems and so on. The ability to analyze data and to translate it into an action very quickly is going to become more and more important. I mean, who would have believed that the general public would learn to read logarithmic graphs? That would never have been possible until now. So, yeah, I think the data science side will be very, very important for us.
Yes. Thank you, Errol. And thank you for that closing remarks. We are out of time now. We've gone a little over time. So thank you to our panelists for your great comments and also for enduring our little technical glitches that we had along the way, and to our audience out there. Thank you. So I'll pass over now back to our moderator, Roberto. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.